aware do you think companies today, especially in Thailand, aware of branding the CEOs?
I think globally, not good, actually, because again, I think there's a differentiation. I think a lot of global companies and a lot of companies in the world, especially in the Western world, I think, have an appreciation of the brand of a company. That's, I think, a given. But when it comes to this branding of the CEO, I think that's quite different, and I think that is not very mature, even in the Western world. But when you come to Asia, I think it's even much more dramatic. There's a book written recently, The Brutal Truth About Asian Branding, and this is about just branding. It's not about CEO branding, but it really talks about how very poor executives' attention is in Asia. And I think we can give very specific examples more towards India and China, because of course they're very rising economies. These are, you might expect very realistically in 10 years' time to be having a branded Chinese product. Why would it have to be an American product or a Japanese product? Why couldn't it be Chinese? Why couldn't it be Indian? I mean, I don't wish to be unkind, but if you today attributed a Chinese or an Indian brand to a brand, it wouldn't be a positive thing necessarily. It wouldn't, in other words, you wouldn't think of that as a luxury item or as a value-added item, as something you're going to pay more money for. But they should be wanting that though, because they have to move up the value chain eventually. So Asian countries should be thinking now, because this is a bit of a long-term thing. You know, typically branding is going to take you to be successful. 1 year would be a very minimal. Up to 5 years is going to be your time. So it's now that a lot of Asian companies should be starting to think about this. And this book particularly was said it's not appreciated by many people who are there.
What about in Thailand?
There's differences. In Thailand, people are very brand conscious. Quite brand conscious. So I think it's different from that perspective. People do appreciate the importance of a brand, because that's how the Thai consumer is. So it's sort of not altruistic, really. You know, they're doing it because they understand the importance of it in Thailand. I don't think people are doing a great job of it, to be honest. I don't think it's necessarily being done very well. But definitely CEOs are more aware of the value of the brand from a company perspective, which is important. But then to themselves as a CEO to a lesser extent. And again, you know, we have this dilemma, as I mentioned before, that CEOs can see this as a negative thing. It's not about, I don't want my ego out there. But especially in Asia and Thailand, this is important, because there is a degree to which CEOs in Asia will say, no, I am a humble person. And that, in fact, to be successful in Asia or Thailand, I need to project myself as a humble person. And how can you project yourself as a humble person and yet have your own strong brand? Unless that brand is a brand of a humble person, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, as long as it aligns to the company itself. You know, you've got to make sure that there's a connection. It's hard to do that when you sell luxury homes and that you're a humble person. Or maybe that's a good contrast, you know, sells luxury homes, but, you know, so you've got to really, I think CEOs have got to recognize that it's not a bad thing. And part of your branding can be about humility. That's not a reason not to do it, because the branding itself adds value to the company. So
some CEOs might think, I don't want to be a celebrity. I don't want to be famous.
Exactly.
I'm not a movie star.
Exactly.
Why do I need to be interested in this? Like what, branding myself?
And this is a good point, actually. In Western companies, typically, of course, CEOs are there to make money. They're there to boost shareholder value. Then it's very obvious, because if it's something that can add 20% to the value of your company by having a brand,
they would do it.
You do it, yeah, and it's in your KPIs, you do it. In Asia, if you want to be more successful, do it. But there's a different dynamic often that happens in Asia, especially with family-owned businesses, and there are a huge amount of them, that family-owned businesses are not that interested in risking themselves or being exposed. They just like to have their 4% growth every year. And that's all they want. That's all they want, because then they can hand that to their children and to the children and to their children. They don't want to jeopardize that by opening risk or. So I would say that's clearly a very good question to ask right at the very beginning is, do you want to grow your company? Do you want to add value to your company? Because it's not. There's quite surprisingly low levels of risk involved in branding a CEO, actually. Even if CEO is doing naughty things, that can be managed particularly. And as we saw in the case of Martha Stewart, sometimes that brand can be complementary to helping them out later on. But there's very little downside to it. There's only a sort of upside. So if the CEO is in any way interested in building their business, I think they should be very seriously considering building their own brand. But to do that in a very careful way. It needs to be continuous. You can't just do it for a week and think, okay, where's all the paper and all the television things? It needs to be every week, every month, every year. Consistent messaging, I think that's another important thing. You have to have the 3 things that you want to say over and over and over again. And in every television interview, every newspaper article, every paper, every book you write, every presentation you give, you say the same 3 things all the time, all the time, all the time. And it sort of gets through, it gets through, it gets through. So it's something that needs to be repeated over a very long period of time. And that becomes part of people's sort of conditional thinking. Whenever they hear that name, they think, Bill Gates, nerdy guy. Steve Jobs, cool guy, but a bit distant. This comes, and you have to make that. You have to actually craft it, but around the personality of the person, because you can't contrive that.
Thank you so much for
Pleasure.
your time today.
Pleasure.
Thank
you very much.
you.
Thanks.
Some CEOs might have a natural tendency to PR themselves, while others can be trained to do so. So branding the CEO might be an interesting option that business owners should look into. See you next time on Viewpoint. สวัสดีค่ะ